The sound of roaring engines filled the crisp morning air as a group of motorcyclists zoomed down an open highway, their bikes gleaming under the sun. Among them, a single rider stood out, not just because of her impeccable riding skills, but because her presence defied every expectation. Dressed in black leather with a helmet bearing an intricate, hand-painted design of a phoenix rising from flames, her name was Amara Jackson. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had fought through barriers of prejudice and hardship to earn her place on the road, where freedom rode in every twist of the throttle. Amara didn't grow up dreaming of motorcycles. In fact, the story began in a quiet southern town, where dreams often felt too big to fit. She was the youngest of 5 children, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. The world around her often told her who she couldn't be. As a young black girl, she heard the whispers, saw the stares, and felt the weight of expectations that didn't include rebellion or risk. But Amara, she wasn't the kind to let the world define her. Her first encounter with a motorcycle happened when she was 14. She remembered it vividly. A neighbor's shiny red bike parked at the edge of their driveway. She couldn't resist running her fingers along the sleek metal. The owner, an older man named Carl, noticed her curiosity and struck up a conversation. "One day," he said, with a wink, "you might ride one of these too." Amara laughed it off, but something sparked inside her, a dream she didn't yet have the words to describe. Years passed, and life wasn't kind. Amara faced the everyday challenges of navigating a world that often dismissed her because of her race and gender. She'd walk into rooms and feel invisible, even when the stares were burning into her skin. In high school, she was told to stay in her lane when she expressed interest in auto mechanics. Even as an adult, working a 9-to-5 job in an industry that felt miles away from her passions, she carried the weight of unspoken doubt, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question if you're enough. But Amara had a quiet defiance in her, a stubborn refusal to give up on the life she wanted, even if she hadn't figured out what that looked like yet. And then one day, the answer came roaring into her world in the form of a motorcycle. She was 24 when she bought her first bike. It was an old, beat-up Honda that had seen better days, but to her, it was magic. Amara spent months restoring it, learning every nut and bolt, every curve of the engine. She worked late into the night in a small garage, her hands stained with grease, her heart pounding with the kind of joy she hadn't felt in years. Riding that bike for the first time was more than just an adrenaline rush, it was freedom. For the first time, she felt untethered from the expectations that had always tried to hold her back. But freedom didn't come without a fight. When Amara joined a local riding group, she was met with skepticism. Some riders ignored her, others were openly hostile. She endured insults, veiled and blatant, and more than once was told, "This isn't a space for someone like you." But Amara didn't flinch. She showed up to every ride, her head held high, her resolve unshakable. Slowly but surely, she earned their respect, not through words, but through action. Her skill, her determination, and her refusal to quit spoke louder than any insult ever could. The turning point came during a charity ride for a local children's hospital. Riders from all over the state gathered for the event, and Amara was determined to be part of it. It wasn't just about proving a point, it was about showing the world that she belonged. The morning of the ride, the leader of the group, a grizzled man named Hank, hesitated to even let her participate. But when an unexpected storm rolled in halfway through the ride, forcing the group to navigate treacherous roads, Amara's leadership shone. She guided the group with precision and care, ensuring everyone made it to the finish line safely. After that, no one could deny her place among them. Amara's story didn't end there. Word of her resilience and skill began to spread, and she found herself becoming a symbol of hope and inspiration, not just for other riders, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She started sharing her journey on social media, not to gain fame, but to connect with others who felt like outsiders in their own lives. Her posts quickly went viral, drawing attention from all corners of the world. People saw her not just as a rider, but as a trailblazer, someone who refused to let hate or doubt dim her light. And yet, her journey wasn't without challenges. With newfound attention came new waves of criticism and hate. But Amara stood firm. She knew her purpose was bigger than herself. She started hosting workshops, teaching young women, especially women of color, how to ride and maintain motorcycles. She partnered with organizations to provide resources for those who couldn't afford to pursue their passions. Amara wasn't just riding for herself anymore. She was paving the way for others to follow. Now, as her bike rode down the highway on this particular day, Amara wasn't just another rider in the pack. She was a symbol of courage, resilience, and the power of defying expectations. The wind rushed past her, carrying her forward toward her next adventure. But just as she thought she'd found her rhythm, something caught her eye. A figure standing on the side of the road, waving for help. Without hesitation, Amara slowed her bike and pulled over, her heart racing. Little did she know, this chance encounter would change everything. It was a moment that would challenge her beliefs, test her limits, and remind her why she started this journey in the first place. Stay tuned, because Amara's story is far from over. The rumble of Amara's bike faded as she coasted to a stop on the side of the highway. Her heart pounded as she took in the scene. A woman standing near a dusty, broken-down car, her arms wrapped tightly around a little girl. The woman looked desperate, waving frantically as the wind whipped her hair across her face. Amara could see the fear in her eyes even before she pulled off her helmet. "You okay?" Amara called out, stepping off her bike. The woman nodded quickly, but glanced around nervously, as if expecting trouble. "Car broke down," she said, her voice tight. "No signal out here. Been stuck for hours." The little girl clung to her mother's side, her eyes wide as she stared at Amara's motorcycle. Amara knew this stretch of highway well. Miles of open road with nothing but trees and occasional gas stations. It wasn't a safe place to be stranded, especially with a child. "I can call someone for you," Amara offered, pulling out her phone. A quick glance at the screen showed she barely had service, but enough to get a call through if she moved closer to the road's edge. Before she could dial, the woman stiffened. Amara followed her gaze and saw a dusty pickup truck slowing down on the opposite side of the road. The truck was old, its paint chipped, and something about it made Amara's instincts kick into high gear. She wasn't sure if it was the way it crawled to a stop or the way the driver lingered behind the wheel watching them. The woman pulled her daughter closer, her knuckles turning white. "I don't like this," she whispered. Neither did Amara. The truck door creaked open, and a man stepped out, tall, broad, and dressed in worn-out jeans and a flannel shirt. He pushed his cap back and took a slow, deliberate step toward them. "Ladies need some help," he drawled. Amara didn't like the way his eyes flicked over them, measuring. She'd seen this before, the kind of look that wasn't about kindness. "We're good," Amara said firmly, shifting slightly in front of the mother and child. The man's gaze landed on her bike, then back on her. "Didn't expect to see a woman riding one of those out here," he said, his tone unreadable. "Especially one like you." Amara's muscles tensed. She'd heard it before, the unspoken challenge, the weight of history in those words. The woman behind her squeezed her daughter's hand, her breathing shallow. "I said we're good," Amara repeated, her voice like steel. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The man exhaled sharply, like he was considering something. Then, without another word, he turned back to his truck. The door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life. Amara watched as the truck sped away, gravel kicking up behind it. The woman let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Amara forced herself to shake off the tension. Let's get you out of here. She managed to get enough signal to call for roadside assistance, then stayed with the woman and her daughter until a tow truck arrived. As the car was loaded up, the woman turned to Amara with gratitude in her eyes. "Not a lot of people would have stopped," she said softly. "Especially, well, you know." Amara knew. The world wasn't always kind to people like them. But that didn't mean they had to live in fear. As she climbed back onto her bike and rode off, the encounter stuck with her. It wasn't just about one moment on the side of the road. It was about everything that came before it. Every challenge, every doubt, every time she had to prove she belonged in a space that tried to push her out. But Amara wasn't done fighting. Later that night, she sat in her garage, staring at her bike. The day had stirred something deep inside her, a fire that had always been there, but now burned hotter. She had spent years carving out a space for herself in the motorcycle world, but what about others? How many people had given up before they even had a chance to ride? She pulled out her phone and started typing, her fingers flying over the screen. A simple post, a call to action. To every woman, every person of color, everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, you do. And if you don't have a place, we'll make one. Who's with me? She hit send. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in. Riders from all over the country, some from other countries, shared their own stories, their own struggles. Messages poured in from young girls saying they'd never seen someone like them on a bike before. From women who had always wanted to ride, but had been too afraid to try. And then came the pushback. Motorcycles aren't political. Why do you have to make everything about race? Maybe if you stopped playing the victim, you wouldn't have problems. Amara had expected it. She had faced worse. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. Days passed, and her following grew. Riders reached out, asking how they could help. A small idea turned into something bigger, a movement. Amara started organizing meetups, riding events specifically for women and marginalized riders. What started as a handful of people turned into something unstoppable. But with visibility came danger. One night, after a ride, Amara found a note taped to her garage door. No name, no signature. Just 3 words scrawled in uneven handwriting. Stay in line. She stared at it, her pulse thudding in her ears. This wasn't just about motorcycles anymore. This was about who got to take up space, who got to be seen. And Amara? She wasn't backing down. Amara's hands tightened around the note, her breath slow and steady, but her mind was racing. She had faced plenty of pushback before, cold stares at rallies, dismissive comments online, whispers behind her back. But this was different. This was a threat, a warning. She glanced around the street, scanning the shadows, but everything was still. Too still. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. She took a deep breath and shoved the note into her jacket. Fear tried to creep into her chest, but she pushed it down. She'd spent too much of her life letting other people's opinions dictate her path. She wasn't about to start now. Instead of hiding, Amara did the opposite. The next morning, she posted a picture of the note with a caption. "You think this will stop me? Try again. I ride for something bigger than fear. I ride for every person who's ever been told they don't belong. And I'm not going anywhere." The post exploded. Thousands of shares. Hundreds of messages. Some were filled with love and encouragement. Others were full of the same hate she'd been battling her whole life. But the difference now, she wasn't alone. A week later, Amara organized the biggest group ride of her life. Riders from all backgrounds, all walks of life, came together, their engines roaring as they took over the streets. Some had flown in from different states. Some had never been part of a riding group before, but they all had one thing in common: they refused to be silenced. The energy was electric. Amara led the pack, her heart pounding in time with the rhythm of the road. As they rode through town, people stopped and stared. Some cheered. Some watched in silence. But no one could ignore them. They were here. They belonged. Then, as they turned onto a long stretch of open road, something shifted. A truck appeared in the distance, parked on the side. The same dusty pickup from before. Amara's stomach twisted, but she didn't slow down. As they passed, the driver locked eyes with her. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't yelling. He was just watching. A challenge. A reminder. But Amara didn't flinch. She twisted the throttle, leading her riders forward, leaving the truck and its driver in the dust. That night, as she parked her bike back at home, she felt something settle inside her. She had spent so much of her life fighting to prove she belonged, pushing back against people who wanted to keep her small. But the truth was, she didn't need anyone's permission to take up space. She already did. The movement she started kept growing. More women, more riders of color, more people who had felt like outsiders found their place on the road. And Amara? She kept riding. Kept pushing. Kept showing up. The threats didn't stop, but neither did the support. She had faced racism, doubt, and fear. She had been told to quit more times than she could count. But through it all, she never let anyone take away what riding gave her: freedom. And as she rode into the horizon, the wind rushing past her, she smiled. Because no matter what came next, she had already won.